The prairie stretched barren and grey beneath the dimming light, a wasteland of brittle grass and wind-whipped dust. A lone rider pressed forward, shoulders hunched against the cold. His coat was frayed at the seams, his boots split at the toes, and his horse moved as though each step might be its last. The animal's ribs showed stark beneath its hide, breath steaming in the air like smoke from a dying fire. The man had been drifting for so long that he could not recall the feel of a roof that belonged to him. He carried little, an old stoolbag, a Bible with its leather cover long gone, and a rifle whose stock bore the marks of years in hard country. Snow began to fall, light at first, then heavier, melting on the brim of his hat before freezing in his beard. He knew the season would only grow crueler from here, and without shelter, neither he nor the horse would last the week. The land around him gave no kindness, only emptiness and the faint outline of a river twisting through the valley. By the river stood a small dwelling, stone-walled and low against the wind. No lantern burned in its window, only a thin column of smoke that told of fire within. The cowboy guided his horse closer, unsure if he was trespassing, yet too weary to turn away. His hand lingered on the rifle at his side, though not from intent to use it, only from habit. The dwelling was no settler's cabin. The stonework, the woven reeds by the door, the basket stacked beneath a slanted roof, they bore the mark of Apache hands. The door opened before he could decide whether to knock or ride on. A woman stepped into the dusk, her shawl drawn tightly around her shoulders. She stood tall, though weariness lined her face. A scar ran from her cheekbone down toward her jaw, deep but long-heeled, like a riverbed carved by time. She looked at him with neither fear nor welcome, only a steady recognition. When she spoke, her voice carried through the wind like an order rather than a request. "Cowboy, we're freezing, come into my shelter at once." The words startled him more than the storm. She did not know him, and yet she commanded him as though she had waited. His instinct was to turn away, to avoid crossing a line that settlers and tribes alike had drawn in blood and suspicion. Yet the wind bit sharp at his ears, and his horse stumbled where it stood. He saw no judgment in her eyes, only necessity. He nodded once, slow, and led the horse to the side of the dwelling before stepping inside. The air within struck him with sudden warmth. Fire crackled in a hearth set against the far wall, its light flickering over clay pots, woven mats, and the plain outline of a rocking chair worn smooth with use. A kettle hissed faintly where steam lifted into the rafters. The space smelled of cedar smoke and dried corn. It was simple, but it was alive, far more than the hollow places he had known on the trail. The woman closed the door behind him. She said nothing more, only returned to the fire and lifted a log with careful hands. The cowboy removed his hat, holding it against his chest, unsure whether to speak or stay silent. He chose silence. Words felt dangerous here, brittle as thin ice. For a time, the only sound was the fire and the slow ticking of melted snow dripping from his coat onto the floor. She did not ask his name. He did not ask hers. He set his rifle aside against the wall, the gesture deliberate, a quiet surrender of threat. She glanced once at the weapon, then back to the fire, her expression unreadable. The man felt the weight of years pressing on him, years of rejection, of wandering roads where no one cared if he came or went. To stand in another's home, to be given warmth without condition, was foreign to him. He sat down on the edge of the mat nearest the hearth, stretching his hands toward the glow, and the ache in his bones eased just enough to make him realize how cold he had been. The woman moved about the room in silence, adjusting the kettle, pulling a shawl tighter as she settled into the rocking chair. The firelight caught on the scar at her cheek, turning it into a mark of flame rather than wound. She looked into the embers as though listening for something beyond them. Neither trusted the other. Yet the storm outside thickened, and the snow fell heavier still. In that small space of warmth, they sat together as strangers, two souls driven by loss into a corner of the world where silence was the only language left. For the first time in many years, the cowboy felt a door had been opened to him. He did not know if it was mercy, defiance, or simply survival that had moved her to speak. But the fact remained, someone had let him in. The days lengthened into a grey stillness, broken only by the small noises of living. The cowboy remained in the widow's shelter while his horse found strength again in the lean grass near the river. He kept to himself, rising at dawn to fetch water or split wood, careful not to intrude more than necessity allowed. She ground corn on the flat stone, the rhythm steady, her sleeves dusted with pale meal. At night, fire cracked in the hearth and boots shuffled across the earthen floor, filling the silence with sounds both homely and hollow. Yet silence carried ghosts. When her hands stilled upon the stone, her eyes clouded with memory. She saw her husband's grave mound rising beneath the cedar trees, remembered how she wrapped him in deer hide with trembling fingers, earth closing over not only the man she had loved but every promise of children, laughter, and a future. She had walked away from that place hollow, the scar on her face a mark of both survival and shame. Across the fire, the cowboy sat with his head bowed, the flames shining on his wedding band, dulled with wear. His thumb moved across it often, as though rubbing away a memory he could not release. He thought of the ranch once his own, the house built with his hands, and of the woman who had walked out when drought shriveled the fields and creditors came knocking. She had chosen a wealthier man, leaving him with nothing but debt, silence, and a horse to carry him into nowhere. Neither spoke of these pasts. Yet grief lived in their gestures. She braided her hair more tightly on days when sorrow rose heavy. He carved at scraps of wood with his knife, though his hands shook with restless memory. They lived in proximity, each carrying abandonment like a second skin. One evening, when frost clung to the riverbank and the breath of cattle could be seen from miles off, he noticed her fence sagging where the posts had rotted. Without words, he fetched hammer and nails from his thulbag and set to work. His blows rang out against the stillness, metal biting into wood. She stood in the doorway, arms folded beneath her shawl, watching as his shoulders bent to the task. He did not look back at her, did not expect thanks. Yet the labor itself was an offering, as though he knew some part of her grief could be eased by the sight of something mended. When the work was done, the fence stood straight again, humble yet stronger. For a moment, her gaze softened. The ember of trust that had long been smothered stirred faintly, a warmth she had not invited yet could not refuse. But the world beyond her walls did not soften. Two settlers rode past as the cowboy gathered the last of the nails. Their eyes lingered, mouths tightening. One spat into the dirt near her gate. Their contempt stung her shoulders straight, her lips pressed thin. She knew too well what they saw, an Apache woman and a drifter cowboy in the same yard, an alliance that had no place in the laws of their bitter world. The cowboy noticed her stiffened posture, the way she retreated back into the shadow of the doorway. He did not speak of it, but his hand rested longer on the fence post, as though anchoring himself there. In that moment both knew the truth. The storm outside their lives was fiercer than the one that had driven him to her door. The world would not forgive them for this shelter, nor for the faint, unspoken bond taking root beneath its roof. And yet, beneath sorrow and watchful silence, something small and stubborn persisted, like a seed buried in frost, waiting for a spring neither of them had believed would come again. The storm came without warning, sweeping across the plains with a voice like rolling drums. The horizon split with lightning, jagged white scars tearing through the black sky. Wind bent the grass low, and rain drove against the earth in sheets so hard it stung the skin. The cowboy had just secured the horse beneath the lean-to when he saw the figure stumble through the curtain of storm. A youth, no more than 17, collapsed against the widow's doorway, blood glistening dark on his side. The woman rushed forward, her shawl flaring like a wing in the gale. She knelt beside the boy, calling his name in her tongue, but his eyes rolled back, his lips ashen. The cowboy did not wait for instruction. He lifted the limp body, feeling the boy's weight like a sack of wet sand, and carried him inside. Rainwater streamed down his coat, pooling on the floor, but he laid the boy gently before the fire. The widow moved with sharp purpose. She stripped away the soaked tunic, revealing the wound torn across his ribs. Her hands found herbs, cloth, a needle, all from baskets and jars that had waited for such a moment. The cowboy held the boy's trembling hand steady while the woman pressed the cloth against the bleeding. The boy groaned, thrashing weakly, and the cowboy murmured low, not words but the kind of sounds one makes to a spooked horse. His palms grew slick with the boy's sweat. The storm deepened, thunder shaking the clay walls so that dust fell from the rafters. Firelight threw restless shadows against their faces. Her scar seemed to burn anew, his weathered lines carved deeper by worry. She prayed softly in her own tongue, her voice rising and falling with each flash of lightning. He did not understand the words, but he felt the weight of them, as if she was holding not only the boy's life but the house itself against the storm. The cowboy sat with his rifle across his lap. His eyes moved from the boy to the shuttered window, every instinct waiting for pursuit. Soldiers would not let an Apache youth slip away without hunting the trail. His body tensed at each gust of wind, each creak of the walls, each distant echo carried by rain. Hours stretched slow. The boy's breathing steadied, though pain still racked him. The widow stitched the wound with a hand that did not falter. The cowboy fed the fire, piling on wood until the room glowed hot, the storm's chill locked outside. Yet even as the boy's life clung stubbornly on, danger pressed close. Near midnight, the pounding of hooves came faint through the storm. Voices shouted, broken by wind and rain. The glow of torches slashed across the riverbank, wavering in the distance. The widow froze, her hand hovering above the boy's bandaged side. The cowboy stood, rifle in hand, every muscle coiled. He placed himself between the door and the boy, his boots planted firm on the earthen floor. The soldiers passed, torches swinging, their curses carried by thunder. For a moment, light swept across the dwelling, shadows trembling along the walls, but no one entered. The shouts receded, swallowed by rain, until only the storm's roar remained. Inside, the three of them breathed as though surfacing from underwater. The widow bowed her head, whispering a final prayer. The cowboy lowered the rifle, setting it across his knees but not releasing it fully. He looked down at the youth lying pale and still, then at the woman whose scar gleamed in the firelight. They had crossed a line now, and there was no return. It was no longer a matter of shared warmth, no longer the uneasy company of two exiles passing winter beneath the same roof. In the hour of storm and pursuit, they had taken on risk together. What bound them now was not chance, but choice. And the storm outside, fierce and unrelenting, was no louder than the one within them both. The storm passed, but it left behind a house no quieter than before. The boy lay restless on his mat by the fire, his wound bound tight beneath the widow's careful hand. Each day his strength returned, and with it his temper. He spat words at the cowboy in his tongue, and when the widow translated in part, the meaning was plain enough. Thief of land. Thief of spirit. Murderer by birthright. The cowboy did not strike back with words, though each insult cut. His jaw tightened, and his hands busied themselves with whatever labor came to hand. He fetched water, split logs until the handle of the axe rubbed blisters deep into his palms, mended straps and boards though none had asked it of him. Silence was his only answer, and yet the weight of it pressed as heavily as anger. The widow moved between them, her shawl drawn close. She set bowls upon the table, her voice quiet but steady, speaking to one, then the other, urging patience neither wished to give. Meals were taken with a sharp silence, the boy glaring across the fire, the cowboy lowering his eyes to his bread as though to avoid striking a spark that might burn them all. Nights were the worst. Firelight painted their faces in flickering shades of suspicion. The boy lay restless, turning from side to side, the cowboy cleaning his rifle slow, each metallic click cutting into the quiet. The widow's rocking chair creaked as she wove, her braid glinting in the fire's glow, her scar catching the light like a line carved by fate. Snow came one evening, soft flakes drifting soundless over the valley. The boy, weary of confinement, waited until the house lay hushed. He rose, wrapping his blanket clumsily around his shoulders, and slipped through the door into the white night. His footprints marked a trail toward the river, reckless and bright against the dark. The cowboy noticed first. He did not call out, did not wake the widow. Instead he followed, his boots sinking into the snow with careful steps. He found the boy shivering near the tree line, his wound pulling at his side, breath ragged in the cold. The cowboy held out nothing but silence, then took the shawl from his own shoulders, heavy with frost, and draped it around the boy. The cloth slipped easily, and for a moment the boy did not resist. The man's hand steadied him by the elbow, then guided him back toward the dwelling. Neither spoke. Snow fell thicker, covering their tracks as they returned. Inside, the boy eased himself back onto his mat, eyes lingering on the cowboy as though seeing him differently, not as enemy, but as man. No thanks passed his lips, but the sharpness in his gaze dulled. The widow watched, though she said nothing. In her silence was understanding. Both these men, so different in blood and history, bore wounds too deep for words. She saw how the boy's distrust was carved from centuries, and how the cowboy's restraint was carved from years of his own rejection. Neither could explain themselves to the other, but a shawl laid over cold shoulders spoke louder than any apology. The house settled again, the fire burning low. 3 souls sat beneath one roof, each carrying their scars, yet the storm between them had shifted, no longer a gale tearing them apart, but a cold wind slowly breaking against the walls of endurance. The days settled into a rhythm, gentler now that the boy's fever had broken. His steps grew steadier, though he still carried his wound with the stubborn pride of youth. The cowboy rose each morning to mend what was broken, patching the roof where snow leaked through, sharpening tools dulled by neglect, hunting rabbit and pheasant in the frozen brush so that their meals stretched farther. His hands moved with a weary skill, as if each task were an old memory pressed back into service. The widow watched him sometimes from the hearth, her fingers working the loom, her eyes resting on the deliberate patience of his labor. Evenings returned them to the fire, the boy often asleep on his mat while the other two remained in the dim glow. She wove slowly, the threads whispering between her hands, and he sat with his knife, shaping small pieces of wood into figures that held no form, only the echo of idle thought. In these silences something began to change. It was not spoken, not asked for, but it breathed in the stillness like a hidden ember, faint yet undeniable. One night, as she fetched cloth from the cedar chest, the cowboy's eyes lingered on what lay folded beneath. The fabric was yellowed with years yet carefully kept, the wedding dress she had once worn when she belonged to another life. His gaze did not linger long, but it caught her breath. She had never remarried, though chances had come. She had chosen silence instead, a long widowhood among wary eyes and whispered judgment. When she closed the chest, her eyes found his hand resting on his knee, the ring glinting faintly in the firelight. It was thin with wear, worn smooth from years of rubbing, yet still circling his finger. He had not cast it aside, though the woman it bound him to had walked away long ago. Symbols met in the firelight, her dress, his ring, tokens of bonds broken but not forgotten, weights neither had been able to release. The fire burned low, shadows stretching long against the clay walls. The crackle of wood filled the space where words should have been. He spoke little, as was his way, yet in that quiet she began to feel something that was not pity, not obligation, but a regard that held her steady without demand. It lived in the way he carried her buckets without being asked, the way he checked the roof twice after each snow, the way his silence sheltered rather than smothered. For the first time since her husband's burial, she allowed her gaze to linger openly on a man's face. His eyes, tired but steady, did not consume her but met her as though she were more than scar, more than widow, more than a remnant clinging to memory. She did not look away in shame, and he did not lower his eyes in avoidance. They did not touch. The space between them held its distance, wide enough to honor grief yet close enough to stir the air with possibility. Snow fell outside in thick silence, blanketing the valley, but inside the fire warmed, and in its glow something fragile stirred awake. It was dangerous, this spark. They both knew it. To allow it breath was to risk judgment, to court sorrow, to invite a world already hostile to press harder against their walls. Yet as the snow deepened and the fire whispered low, neither could deny the slow, dangerous warmth rising within. It was not yet love. Not yet spoken. But it was life returning, and for two souls who had long thought themselves abandoned to emptiness, even the smallest spark was enough to change the dark. The first light of dawn came cold and pale, the snow hard-packed beneath its thin glow. Smoke still drifted from the widow's chimney when the sound of horses reached them, many, moving slow and deliberate. The boy rose from his mat, his face tightening with recognition, and the widow's hand pressed to her scar as though the world had come for her once more. The cowboy took up his rifle, the weight of it familiar, though the odds it faced were not. Outside, the soldiers spread in a half-circle, steam rising from their mounts, rifles slung, torches guttering against the wind. Their boots stamped frost into the earth. The house stood small before them, nothing more than clay and stone, but it held what they had come for. The boy's blood ran hot. He snatched at his knife, his body trembling not with weakness now but with fury. "I will not go back," he hissed. But the widow caught his wrist, her voice low and urgent. "Survival," she whispered, her dark eyes holding his. "That is the truest courage." The words broke against him like a wave, slowing but not silencing. His breath came ragged, his chest heaving, yet his hand fell open. The cowboy stepped outside, rifle firm in his hands, his boots sinking into the snow. He stood alone before the line of soldiers. His voice, when it came, carried not the bark of command nor the heat of anger, but something heavier, years of loss, of wandering, of truths burned down to bone. He told them to leave, to take what they had come for but go no farther, not to break what little peace remained in this house. The words were plain, stripped of pride, yet they rang out across the frozen ground like a bell struck hard. The soldiers shifted, uneasy. None raised a weapon. Perhaps it was the steadiness in his stance, or the weight of a man who had nothing left to fear. One among them spat into the snow, then moved to seize the boy. The youth's eyes blazed, but he did not resist, not with the widow's hand still upon his arm. They led him away, their torches flickering smaller with each step into the dawn. The last man paused, his gaze lingering on the woman in the doorway. Contempt narrowed his mouth. He spat at her feet before turning his horse, the insult stinging sharper than any lash. Then they were gone, leaving only silence, trampled snow, and the smoke of their torches fading into morning. The cowboy lowered his rifle slowly. His shoulders sagged beneath the weight of the choice made. When he stepped back inside, he braced for her fury, her grief, the bitterness of a bond severed too soon. But she said nothing. Instead, she placed her hand over his, her fingers light upon the scars that marred his knuckles. Her touch was neither desperate nor accusing. It was simple, human, and steady. The boy would walk his own path now, the world waiting to crush or spare him as it pleased. Yet in this small room, in the hush after danger, something endured. They had not chosen this life together, but they had endured its trials side by side. In that endurance, something more had been born, not merely survival, but the faint outline of a life that might be built anew. When at last they saddled the horse and rode into town, it was not as strangers. The snow crunched beneath hooves, breath rising in clouds, the road stretching out before them like a blank page. They rode not as saviors, not as conquerors, but as companions. Weathered souls who, in the quiet wreckage of loss, had found the courage to face winter together. The land was still cruel, the world still harsh. Yet between dust and silence, fire and snow, the smallest root of hope had taken hold. And for them, that was enough.